Okay, looks like we're going to go ahead and start recording here. And as I mentioned a minute ago, I'll pass around a sign-in sheet for those who are here in person. We are required to do that, and it's a post-COVID sort of thing. We don't turn it into anybody, but so wherever you're sitting, and wherever you plan to sit, make sure you're comfortable. Some people like to sit in front, some people like to sit back, some like to sit near a door, whatever. That's fine. Just try to do that next time so that you're comfortable where you are. And for those of you who are watching on the live Zoom link that do plan to attend some class sessions, just be aware if somebody's sitting in a seat. Oh, it's maybe somebody's live.
Hey, Vanessa, could you mute your video?
Yeah.
Let me mute everybody here. Looks like everyone's muted, so okay. So does anybody have any questions about anything we talked about on Monday? We had an abbreviated class session just given the nature of the first day, and I think I indicated at the outset that we weren't going to do a whole class session just because we do have people still enrolling in the class. In fact, we've got probably now 3 or 4 who are going to be new to it. So, but I do need to get going with the material today. Also, for those who are watching on Zoom or are going to pick the feed up later, Monday's class was not the standard of quality that we ascribed to. We had some difficulty. There was something technically wrong with this computer. I don't know what, but the AV Tech apparently had. That video was the screen share of me going through the Brightspace course site. And that was it. That's really all that I intended to do. So the good news is I really didn't need to write more then. I will today, and I'm recording this class session now. For those of you who are watching live, I've also got the transcription at the bottom as well, if you like that as well. So anybody have any questions for me, either live on Zoom or here in the classroom about what we're doing, where we're going in the class, etc. Okay, so anyway, I'll do the seating chart next time. One thing I wanted to mention to everybody, I sent an email out just before class, it's probably an hour ago, and the email was just directing how to get to the class videos. And so if you go to the Brightspace site, because I think it seems to be that I mentioned the class on Monday, I posted a link in the main landing site, and I didn't do that because I happened to think, well, I'm going to be jamming this up with announcements and whatnot and Zoom links, and I do usually have a weekly announcement as well. So I just posted it within the week's module. So if you go into Brightspace, coursework content, and you'll see it there. And has anybody been able to look at that video? I think I didn't post it till last night, but it's easy to get to. I just uploaded it to YouTube. I had a bit of a difficulty doing it last time, and I tried to cut out some of the conversation between the AV guy and myself, but I was sort of unable to do that. But anyway, at any rate, that is available. That's where it'll be. You'll see it. For those of you who want to go back and watch that at some time in the future. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. And if anybody has any questions, and for those of you who are watching live on the Zoom link, a couple things. You want to enter, when you enter that, you want to put your name, if you would, because some of you have like user IDs that don't resemble your name at all. So if you can do that, it's a way to capture your attendance. Zoom actually captures your attendance and it sort of downloads it to an Excel file. So next time when you log in, please try to remember to do that. And for those of you who want to watch it live, just make sure that, or don't watch live, just record your attendance to the attendance link that you'll see under the week 1 module. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. I mentioned to you on, oops, wait. There we go. Nope, that's the wrong way. Everything's backwards in this room. So I mentioned last time that we were going to start from the very beginning in this class. So we were going to assume that nobody has had any econ before. So we're going to start from the very beginning. Now, by the way, these slides are also found in your learning modules, so you can download those and use those if you like. I'm going to try to turn the lights down a bit to try to make it easier. Shades are down, that's good. So try to make it, oops, I made it worse, didn't it? Is that better? Oh, let's put some better. So we'll go ahead and get started. I mentioned that we were just going to start from the very beginning, assuming you've never had any econ before. And so we're going to start with a very basic question. What is econ? So that's the question, what is econ? And So so that's the question. The answer is it's a social science dealing with choices made under conditions of scarcity and uncertainty. And we're going to talk about what these are, sort of tear into this a little bit. This is a social science, and so unlike the physical sciences where there are laws that apply, like the law of gravity, law of electromagnetism and whatnot, we don't really have that many true hard and fast laws in economics. In fact, next week when we get into chapter 3, talking about demand and supply, we're going to see that the law of demand and the law of supply are really about it. Unlike in mathematics and physics and chemistry, where there are these hard and fast laws, social sciences are a little bit more squishy. And in fact, we're going to make the case that the law of demand has some violators. And so how hard and fast could a law be if reality says that sometimes that law can be violated? Nobody can violate the law of gravity to the speed of light or whatever. You can certainly in this. And so social sciences deal with the fact that we're all changing, we're all going through our different things and whatnot. So as a result, it's dealing with how people react to things. And we'll talk more about the definition of markets here in a minute. Choices made, we're certainly going to talk about this idea of what the motivations are of the economic actors. So we're going to make the case that there are 3 groups of actors, and we'll get to them in a minute. And we'll talk about what their various motivations are, how we categorize them, and what they are up to. And then scarcity is a really important issue. And I mentioned this in the week 1 learning objective. I said scarcity is really going to be an important aspect of what economics is about. If there were no scarcity, I don't know that there would be any need to study economics at all, because what would be the point? If there were no scarcity of anything, then what would be the point of our talking about how we distribute things, how we make things and whatnot? When we talk about scarcity, we know that there is scarcity, and for the foreseeable future, I guess, certainly in my lifetime, I don't think the idea of scarcity is ever really going to go away. It's going to go to zero. So even if we invent new things, and there are some things that scarcity 200 years ago was real, things like food scarcity and whatnot. And yes, there's food scarcity in parts of the world today, but I think probably for most of us, that's not as pressing an issue as it is in some other places. But what are some of the things that we're dealing with when we talk about scarcity that are really pressing major economic issues of our time? Scarcity of what, do you think?
Water.
Water, yeah, water is certainly a scarce resource, particularly in this part of the country. And what's interesting about that is that, I come from the upper Midwest, where if anything, we've got too much water. And so, you've got, it's not that we have too little water on Earth, so we don't have the water in the right places. And I think that what we're going to probably see at some point is, particularly for the Western states, some sort of means by which water is redistributed to this part of the country, because we've got so many people living here, and yet we're using a lot of water and we're not getting as much of it. I just went through Lake Mead the other day, and it's down. Now there's rain in California, so that's going to be helping our situation, maybe a little bit, but who knows. But water is a bit of scarcity. Things like healthcare is an issue of scarcity. I wish we had more time really in this class to talk more about healthcare and the availability and the distribution of the cost, because you can do an entire degree program on just that. So scarcity is a real issue. We'll talk about the definition of scarcity in a minute. And then the second one, you can probably put a period here, and this will be sort of the textbook definition that will suffice and across, most textbooks, most economists would probably agree with that. But I kind of threw in uncertainty here, because as we get toward the end of the semester, we're going to talk more about uncertainty, particularly as it applies here in micro. And that is the idea that we don't know what we don't know. And I know maybe that sounds like double talk, but it really is a serious problem. We don't know the things that we don't know. We know, and I know that President Bush had a defense secretary a few years ago who was on TV saying that there are known knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and it sounded like he was really he was tripping or something. And that's not, but really I think what he was saying is something that I think we would understand as economists. There are things that we know that we don't know. There are things we know that we don't know for sure, but it's the things that we don't know that are really tripping us up. And that is, if you think back to the housing crisis that began in around 2007, 2008, it basically brought the big banks down. And I was a banker for 19 years, and so I worked in the industry for a long time. And I kind of grew up in this culture of believing that banks were these impenetrable big granite buildings with steel vaults. They couldn't fail. We had all this worked out. and yet they were toppling over like dominoes, and nobody really thought that that could happen. So if we were certain it would happen, it probably would not have happened. And without government intervention, it would have, and we probably would have gone into some sort of deep depression, which we may still be struggling with had we not known that. But it was not known that these financial instruments that Warren Buffett, the great investor, called financial weapons of mass destruction, could actually bring down the financial system in the entire economy. So those are things that we have to deal with on a routine basis in economics, the things that we don't know that we don't know, and so it's difficult. So back to the issue of scarcity. The definition out of the dictionary is the quality or state of being scarce, and that is one, provisions for the support of life. This comes right out of the dictionary, but I like this one best. Deficient quantity or number compared with the demand. It sounds more like an economics explanation that is not plentiful or abundant. So deficient in relation to demand, and that's really what scarcity is. And if you consider the fact that our demands go on and on, but yet our supply of things are not there, that's an issue. Now, there's been a question before, and we'll get to this in a second, and that is this idea of unlimited wants. And we'll get to that here in just a second with what's called the economizing problem. And that is this, and I'll flip back to the scare because I know some of you are writing, the conflict between society's unlimited wants and the reality of scarce resources. And I guess the question that I would ask about scarcity as a definition derived from demand is, the question I would have for you is, are our demands really unlimited? Because we're making the case, or some people make the case in economics that our demands are infinite, that we have an unlimited, unbounded set of demands that we'll never be satisfied with. Even if we cured cancer, which I know is not one disease, it's a lot of diseases. Even if we cured cancer, we would probably keep moving on to solve other dreaded diseases. But what do you think about that question? Are our demands unlimited, really? Are they truly unlimited? Or are we ever going to be satisfied and say, oh, we're done? What do you think about that question?
It depends on the person.
Depends on the person? Okay, could be. There are some people who probably are content with things the way they are and are not moving forward. Society, I think, maybe we can make a different case. Is that a fair statement, though, that our wants, that our demands are unlimited, that we want and whatnot? Well, I think it's something to think about. And so I want to sort of move up to this next point, and that flows directly out of the whole issue of scarcity. And that's the idea of what's called the economizing problem in economics. This is not in your text, but it shows up a lot of times in economics. And I think it's an important thing for us to be aware of. The economizing problem is really the central problem in economics. Economics being the social science dealing with the production, distribution, consumption, resources, and distribution of money, and things like that. And yet there's a conflict that's inherent. And until we solve the scarcity problem, it's always going to be there. And that's the conflict between our unlimited wants and the reality of scarce resources. That is, we've got a scarcity of all kinds of things, such as what? What resources are there that are out there for us to use are scarce? Such as what?
Wood?
Well, sure, yeah, scarcity of workers for sure right now. There's been a labor shortage, which is pretty incredible. And in fact, if you take macro, we're going to talk a lot about this issue of labor shortage and why it's pushing wages up. It's also pushing prices up. It was interesting. I was watching the National Geographic channel the other night, and they were, how they have this show on drug traffickers, and I think it was Colombia. And they were talking about they're growing coca crops. They had a shortage. They had a labor shortage. It's like, you gotta be kidding me. Even in the illegal economy, there's a labor shortage. So global phenomena right now. There's shortage of labor. Our demands are outstripping our ability to provide the goods that are wanted, and whether or not cocaine is an actual good or as opposed to a bad is, I guess, you're up to you as to how you want to define that. But I thought it was interesting. This is a global phenomenon. It's certainly the scarcity of labor, but things like natural resources too. And we're going to get to here in a second talking about natural resources and the fact that they are scarce. And then one thing I'll talk about that is maybe less obvious is time. Time is a scarce resource, and believe me, even though I may be sort of approaching my retirement years. I'm not quite there yet. I'm not quite ready to go yet, but I don't really feel any different than what I did when I was 25, and which is a good thing, And but yet I realize time is flying by. It's flying by, and a lot of things that you want to do just simply can't do. You can't do it all. You've got to allocate your time. You've only got so many hours in a day. You can manage your time better. But time is a big one. It's a huge issue in terms of how we manage our time. Okay. All right. So questions about the economizing problem and what it is, what it's about. And I want to emphasize too this term conflict, because I mean that term very deliberately, because one thing that we're going to see in economics is that you're going to see a lot of opposing forces going up against each other. Suppliers versus demanders, government against producers, workers against employers in some cases. So there is conflict, and I don't mean violent, WWE SmackDown kind of conflict, but nonetheless conflict. If I want something and I'm engaged in some sort of event with you, and you want something else, that's conflict, right? You want a house, you want to sell it to me, and I want to buy it from you. You want a high price, and I want a low price, right? So that's immediately, that's immediately an issue of conflict. And so we're going to sort of talk about this. And the other thing too that I'll mention, this probably comes up a little bit less in micro than it does in macroeconomics, but there are a lot of things in economics that are controversial. And we talk about theories and legal proposals that you may think, this is crazy, I don't agree with it, I don't like it, and it may be upsetting in some cases. And so, there is controversy. And so I think that the thing to know about econ is that not everyone agrees with all the kinds of things that we're presented with. I also teach, there's a survey course, very entry level, 100 level course that I teach here, and I teach a bit of economic history, and we get into talking about Karl Marx and some of his work. And a lot of students really don't like that at all. They say, why are we talking about Karl Marx? Because he did advocate a violent revolution. But we did it because he's got an influence on modern economic thinking, even though he sort of is not really wearing that well into the 21st century. But from an economic history piece, we talk about it because it is an advocacy of conflict. Okay, so what's next here on this? Wants versus needs. Let's talk about this. There's a difference, I think, between wants versus needs. That is the idea that for the most part, in a modern economy like our own, the thinking is that for the most part, our needs are mostly met. Now, I think you could make a strong argument that healthcare is probably not really met. Excuse me, I've got asthma. I'm not sick or anything. It's just sometimes I get a little irritated. So I think that there is an argument to be made in the industrial world, which is where we live now in Europe and Japan and Australia, that I think that for the most part, I think people would argue that our needs are mostly met. With possible exception, maybe healthcare, which is not always as available, as cost effective as it needs to be. So that we're really mostly on to wants. We're mostly dealing with wants. Was it?
I was saying at least here.
Yeah.
Healthcare.
Yeah, certainly in our country, yeah. In our country, once the issue of healthcare is not necessarily as available and as affordable as what a lot of us would want. So I think the issue then is are we really, as a modern economy, producing mostly wants? And I think the answer to that is we probably are, because if you look at the total output of goods and services in our economy, it's mostly the stuff that we want and not that we need. That every year that goes by, the percentage of output that goes to food and clothing and housing goes down, while the percentage that goes to things like electronics and entertainment, travel and all this other goes up. So even things like education, which is not really a need, although it sounds like an ironic thing for somebody in the higher ed business to talk about, I think that for the most part, we're really on to the wants. That's really what we're producing. And what's very ironic and very tragic about it is there are parts of the world in which this equation is flipped around, where it's primarily about producing what people need, and even there, that production is insufficient to deal with what people need.
I mean, yeah, people are in debt for the rest of their lives, and to be told that like it's all due to want when it's basically education and healthcare and stuff like that. I really don't want to hear like right-wing talking points. I'm really sorry to bring up like politics and stuff like that, but it's hard to hear this.
Hard to hear what?
That like all the debt that people are like, oh, it's just a bunch of wants. This is the country of all the, like, we just have a bunch of wants. We don't have needs and stuff like that. It's hard to listen to.
Okay, well, okay. You're not thinking I'm producing right-wing talking points, I hope. But, and by the way, I try to keep my politics out of the class as much as possible. I really don't, because whatever I say, I really don't want students to think, the only reason he says this is because he's a conservative, he's a liberal, whatever. In reality, I'm probably pretty mainstream, but I do try to sort of keep that between the lines. But yeah, I mean, that's, look, there are people who do criticize the consumer, and we have certainly heard a lot of this. In fact, I saw an article yesterday about the fact that, and this is not new, where it's like the buy now, pay later eras is gone and all this. And, we've been hearing this for a very long time. And the fact that people borrow money is not anything new. And in fact, there's nothing really, there's no real stigma to it as long as you're able to afford it. I mean, think about higher education. Most people wouldn't be able to afford higher education if you weren't able to borrow money. And so, but nobody says, hey, you shouldn't do that because it's a waste of money. I mean, some people probably do relate to higher ed, but for the most part, not. So, but anyway, this whole idea of wants versus needs, I think is an interesting question. Are we producing mostly wants or needs? And I think that I'm really trying to sort of emphasize the difference between the industrial world and the non-industrial world, where a lot of the production is going toward needs as opposed to wants. And I think that a lot of what we are producing today is in the form of wants, that sort of thing. So when we talk about the economy as a problem, what is the solution? And it may not be a perfect solution, okay? And when I say solution, this is not the be all end all. By the way, there are a lot of people, and probably some people teaching in econ departments and business schools all around the world, who would say the free market system is infallible and does no wrong. And I think that there's ample evidence that that is not the case. We are going to talk about a particular area of microeconomics called market failure a bit later in the class. And the idea of market failure is not some criticism per se of the market system. It's saying that sometimes markets don't always work efficiently. And when they don't work efficiently, there's got to be some sort of solution that usually requires a governmental solution. There are those who believe that free markets do tend to work optimally and that government should stay out of the way. I think it's very difficult to make the argument that government should have no role whatsoever. And there are those who do argue. So we say the free market system, I think the evidence is pretty evident. And I've been teaching for a while. And when I first started teaching, the Soviet Union had just fallen, and the command economies were basically in free fall. And if you consider the fact that the standards of living were
How you doing, Matt? This is Tony or Anthony.
Starkly different between
Doing all right, sir. How you doing?
Oh, not too bad.
I'm gonna turn
It's been a crazy day.
Oh man. So
On the program, I did find out.
Anthony,
Anthony,
got to mute you. Actually, we've got a couple people we need to mute here.
Or the way we're set up, we don't participate in that program. I reached out to our branch manager and our senior director, and we don't participate. It's not part of our portfolio of loans that we can do. We don't do those in USDA.
There we go. So actually, I couldn't even. Usually, you can click on the mute, but I just had to remove him, so he's not gonna like that. But hopefully, he'll figure out how to rejoin. So I don't like to take people out of class, but I couldn't get him to mute. He apparently was fearing on a conversation, so that does happen. That's it is what it is. Okay. Where was I? Free markets. Oh, we were talking about the contrast between the industrial economies, primarily the West, and the Eastern economies, the command economies. And I think the evidence was pretty good that if a government becomes too involved and tries to control everything, it is also problematic as well. And so free markets are good. It is a solution. We're going to talk about governmental involvement, particularly when markets don't always work well. So the free market system does tend to be a solution to this idea of scarcity. It's not a perfect solution because there still are allocation issues. Things are not fair. What are some things that are uneven? It doesn't take an economist to say what are things that are uneven, and we know that they're uneven or unequal, such as what?
What do you mean by that?
What in our economy? What things are uneven? What are things are unevenly distributed? Income, wealth, right? Income and wealth are not evenly distributed, and we know that. And we may get into a bit of this if we have time toward the end of the semester. There's a bit on income distribution. And here's the thing about it: we know that income is not evenly distributed, but what is the trend of it? Is it becoming more even or more uneven over time? What's the trend? More uneven. More uneven. And there's a lot of thinking about this subject in lots of circles in economics about where this is going. If the wealthy are continuing to get wealthy, and it's not as though the poor are necessarily getting poorer, but they're certainly not making progress, and definitely that large middle class is sort of shrinking and scrunching a little bit, and they're not really making that much progress. And now that we've got inflation, they're really not making progress against that. What is the end result here? Can we go on forever? Where's the outer limit to that? And I'll point you to the work of a French economist named Thomas Piketty, who talks a lot about this, about where we go with this. Where does this end? Where we have the wealthy are getting wealthy and everyone else maybe not getting worse off, although there are people who do get worse off of them. There's no question about that. But they're outstripping the middle. And so we'll talk about that a bit later. So let's talk about a market. What is the definition? It's an organized means by which people exchange value. Okay, an organized means by which people exchange value. And this sounds pretty indefinite. We say people. What do we mean by people? Well, again, we're talking about a social science, and so we're going to talk about these actors and who they are. But we are talking essentially about people in their role as people, and what they're doing, what their motivations are. And so we're certainly going to talk a bit about markets, and we're going to get to that here in just a second. Okay, so questions so far about any of this? Okay, I do have a habit of looking at the clock, and I know that sometimes people think kind of unnerves people. I know people have commented in their course reviews, hey, why is he always looking at the clock? And it's just for me to keep track so that I can keep pace, because if I get off and ramble on something, I know that the clock is sort of ending me in here so that I can get done what I want to get done. Okay, there are two branches of econ, micro and macro. So we're going to be focusing primarily on micro in this course, but we will cover some areas of macro, and that is that there is some overlap, particularly in these first couple of weeks. And we're going to be covering some of the fundamentals of economics that are going to be not unique to either, but are common to both micro and macro. And for those of you who've had macro before, a lot of this will be very familiar too, at least for the first couple of weeks. Until we get beyond the first three chapters, then we'll start to split away. I know I routinely have students who have taken, or maybe they're taking both classes at the same time, who will email me or call me and say, are you sure these are two different classes? And did I do something wrong? It's like, no, it's just that we're going to cover, there's no prereq for either one. So we're going to cover some of the fundamentals to both. What's interesting about this is that macro did not really exist as a thing until sometime after the Great Depression set in the 1930s. There seemed to be really no call for this. And by the way, when we're talking about the entire economy, there were really no good measurement tools in those days. Telecommunications was really still in its infancy, to be honest with you. And so the way to collect data was really sort of poor. And so there really wasn't such a thing as macro. There's some debate as to who invented the term macroeconomics itself, because it's something that's brand new. But it grew out of this idea that the macroeconomy, the big picture view of the economy, was something different than the more fundamental view of micro. And one of the things that I will point you to is that micro tends to be what we call the small picture view of the economy, and macro the big picture view of the economy. That is, when we talk about micro, the key word here is individual. We're studying individual items, individual actors. That is, individual consumers buying individual goods at individual prices from individual producers and going to work as individuals and whatnot. So we're talking about slices of the economy. Whereas in macroeconomics, we're talking about the entire economy, including the global economy. And I know that we used to have a textbook for our introductory class in our survey course that I think had a pretty good metaphor for this, and that was the authors likened micro to being what they refer to as street level economics, which I really liked a lot. And that was the idea that this is where really we live as economic beings, is in the microeconomic realm primarily. We are in the macro realm, we just may not be aware of it too much. But it's the idea of us going to work and earning an individual wage and acting as a worker from 9 to 5 or whatever, and then after 5 o'clock, maybe stopping off at Albertsons and picking up food and whatnot, and then acting as a consumer and as an individual and doing certain things. And that, it's the street level view of where we live. Whereas the macro view is sort of from outer space, that you can see the entire economy, including, by the way, the global economy. And increasingly, because we're an integrated world globally, that we have to take these global forces into account. And that has greatly complicated the work of economists because of the fact that there's a lot of differences in measurement between economies. There are different currencies involved. There are different policies that are in effect. And so it does add complications, even though there are lots of opportunities. And I think most economists would argue that globalization has been a good thing as opposed to a bad thing, even though I know that there are some downsides to globalization, including, particularly in our country, the idea that a lot of firms have left their production operations behind here and have gone to other countries, primarily due to the issue of cost, wage costs, regulatory costs, things of that nature. So the macro view is from outer space, looking at the entire economy. And that was not really done prior to the Great Depression, which was really one of the deficiencies that we talk about in macro, is the idea that really nobody was looking at this idea of how all these pieces fit together, because I think prior to the Great Depression, which set in the 1930s, that the idea was that the economy, macroeconomy itself, to the extent that that concept was even being thought about, was simply an aggregation, a collection of all individual markets. And if we simply got these markets to work correctly and adequately like they're supposed to do, then everything would be fine. And during the beginning of the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, who was the president, said, well, the economy is fundamentally strong, which, by the way, were the same words that George W. Bush used when the economy began to slide out of control in 2008. Now, obviously, presidents are always cheerleaders for the economy. We know that regardless of the Republicans or Democrats, it doesn't make any difference. They're always going to be talking up the good things about the economy. But for the most part, I think we should be aware that the macroeconomy is something different. It's not just the aggregation. The whole is bigger than the sum of the parts, in other words. And one of the things that's interesting is in micro is that, unlike in macro, one of the things that we do, and we will do in this course, is we'll look at individual markets as being slices of the economy. In other words, we'll just sort of bore into a particular market. And when we talk about markets, it's probably useful to think about the metaphor of a Russian doll. And I don't know if anybody's seen one Russian. Have you ever seen a Russian doll where you have this big doll and you open it up and there's a smaller doll, and you open that up, there's a smaller doll? Well, it's the same thing in microeconomics. If we wanted to take the market for pizza, let's say, and let's say take the market for pizza in Albuquerque, and we could focus on the market for pizza in Albuquerque, and then we could say, okay, well, let's focus in on the market for pizza in Northwest Albuquerque. And so we focus on the market for pizza in Northwest Albuquerque, which, by the way, is not an unusual scenario. If you're in the pizza business, you want to know how much competition there is, what the composition of households are, how many people are in the household, what's their buying power and all that. And maybe you really want to hone in on the Northwest Albuquerque, say east of Coors, north of Paseo, or whatever. You can zoom in and zoom out, and that's what's going on with the slices of the economy. The Russian doll, where you can make it smaller, or bigger and bigger, depending upon what your particular view is. And that's what really the study of markets is about, this zooming in, zooming out sort of thing that we do a lot of, okay? And so we'll be focusing on that in micro, this idea of, because we hear a lot, about, hey, the market for electric vehicles or whatever. Well, what market for electric vehicles is the US market? Is it the Western United States? Is it, North America? What is the market? If somebody has not defined what that market is, then we are simply left with a statements when they talk about the market for electric vehicles, right? EVs. Okay, so it's a study of markets. and to finalize this, some fields are labor economics. Some of these we're going to get into in this class, some we're not, just because of the time constraint. Labor economics is an important part of micro. Industrial organization is one that we will talk a lot about in this course, and that is the idea. It's also known as market structure theory. We're going to talk about the economics of business firms and the sort of ecosystem in which they operate. And we're going to say that they're different. We're going to talk about 4 distinctly different sorts of structures. Information economics is probably among the newest. And we say information here, it's not necessarily information systems, which is what maybe you might be thinking about, but instead it's information in the most basic way that we know it. And that is the idea that we don't know certain things, and that because of that, we make decisions based on incomplete information. And we're going to talk about this idea, this major area of economics, which has really gained lots of traction in the last few years, and that's something called asymmetric information. And that is, in a complicated world that we're living in, we just don't have enough information to make decisions, and so we do the best we can with what we've got. You go to the doctor, and your doctor says, "Wow, you need surgery," and you might get a second opinion, and maybe the second doctor says, "No, you don't need surgery." Well, then what are you supposed to do? You got one doctor saying one thing, one doctor saying the other. Now what do? Do you get a third opinion as a tiebreaker? How long do you want to keep this going? You know, until you figure out who's, and are you to determine? First of all, are you to argue with medical doctors? I don't know what they know, certainly. And by the way, it's not even things like this. I mean, I was telling a class not too long ago, I had gotten my pension statement in the mail, and as I'm about 7 years from retirement, I'm now beginning to look at it a little bit more closely. And there were a lot of things, and I kind of feel like I'm, as well informed as anybody of finance in general. There were a lot of things I just did not understand on that statement. And I thought, well, how can somebody who doesn't have any kind of background in economics and finance, how can they possibly understand what the heck is being talked about? Actuarial present value of life expectancy discounted back to the present. It's like, what are you talking about? You know? So you get the idea. It's a complicated world. Information economics seeks to determine how we make decisions based upon incomplete, misleading, or incorrect, or just unequal amounts of information. And if we go back to the example of, you have a house you want to sell me, I have a house and I want to buy your house. What might you not tell me about that house of yours that you don't really want me to know about? What might you want to withhold from me if you're that sort of person? Well, the roof leaks maybe, or when every time the furnace kicks in, or whatever, or something that's pretty distasteful. That happens a lot. This idea of trying to conceal information. And I know there are warranties out there, and you probably should get a home inspection if you're buying a used home, but nonetheless, there are these issues that do come up. Same goes with cars and whatnot. We're going to talk about the market for used cars a bit more specifically when we talk about this. Financial economics is the area that I was trained in throughout college and grad school. And we're not really going to get into that, unfortunately, but we just don't really have the time in an intro class. In industrial regulation, we will definitely talk about this idea of how we regulate industry, how industry is not free to do whatever they want to do, but we sort of hem them in with regulation so as to protect the broader society. Okay, and to finish this up, when we talk about macro, one of the things that differentiates macro from micro is this idea of very, very large variables. And we're talking about the US economy producing, say, $24 trillion of output a year. That's 24 with 12 zeros, or 24 with 12 zeros behind it every year. And if you take the amount of US savings, it's in the trillions of dollars. These are big numbers. I mean, most of us won't deal with trillions or maybe even billions anytime in our lifetime, even if we work for big corporations. These are very large variables, and sometimes they're just beyond our understanding. And that's itself a problem. And some fields, just real briefly, because I don't want to spend a lot of time on macro, but monetary economics, which deals with the issuance of money, all that. Trade studies, which I intend to try to get to some of this, but as I indicated in class on Monday, if we don't get to some of this toward the very end of the semester, it's, I don't think anyone's going to be too upset about it. I hope that you don't worry about that, but we'll, as time goes by, we'll see if we have time business cycle analysis, which is what I think the average person would view macroeconomics as being about, and that is, are we going into a recession, et cetera? And that's been a burning question in macro for a while now. Are we heading toward a recession? And it's a good question because it's signs we're starting to see big layoffs now at firms. I think Facebook is laying off like 11,000 people, and Amazon's laying off 10,000 people, and that's the beginning. They're going to start laying off some more people as well. I don't know whether this impacts anybody in Los Lunas, which I don't think is I don't know if anybody knows about that at all, but we're starting to see big layoffs, and I think that's a precursor to a recession. We might be tipping into one. So the signs look pretty good toward that. Okay, so questions so far about anything? You can feel free to jump in. And this is a small enough group, even if you include the online folks. So you feel free to jump in if you like, and unmute yourself and say, "Hey, what did you say?" or whatnot. Feel free. I just want to briefly, without sort of spending lots of time on this. This slide's small. I hope you guys can see this on the YouTube, on the Zoom, well, YouTube if you're watching the recorded video, but it is captured in the slide package in Brightspace. So what do economists do? I just thought I would bring this up just because it's pretty rare that you actually encounter too many economists. I think there are only about 11,000 economists practicing in the United States today, and that's not a very big number. I think there are more neurosurgeons than there are economists, and yet there's a lot of opportunity for people to do economics. And I have a number of students who've gone on to graduate school and done PhDs and whatnot. So there are lots of areas to go, such as teaching, like what I primarily do, working for the government, working in business. And so you've got a pretty broad category there. I have my own business as well, and so so I'm doing a little bit of number one and number three there. They do provide consulting services, for better or worse, to companies based upon the idea a lot of economists are trained in some advanced statistical methods that most people don't get exposed to, and so they sometimes are useful in that regard, particularly in terms of trying to determine trends and whatnot. They advise political leaders, and this is an important aspect of what economists do, and that's, I think that we really cannot expect our elected officials to have a perfect grounding in economics. We have, for instance, never had a president who's had an economics background that I'm aware of, at least, and they instead rely upon economists to give advice, and good advice. And I know that one of the things that I heard early on, I think the very first class I took during my doctoral program was our instructor said, "Make sure your math is right." And she goes, "I know it sounds pretty obvious, but in the real world, people aren't going to check your math, and they're going to take your word for it." And I thought, really? And I thought, you know what? She's right about that. I mean, when's the last time you got a P&M bill and thought, "Oh, I'm going to check this out"? You know, start tearing into the kilowatt hours times rate per kilowatt. You just really don't. You just sort of think, okay, it's right. It's got to be right. Now, occasionally, a lot of people do. I know we had people when I was in banking would sort of tear into interest and how much interest they paid. And, "Oh, I think you guys are wrong." And it's like, no, I don't think so. But, you know, so there are people who do try to check them out. But for the most part, that's one of the things that as sort of applied mathematicians that we do. And then one thing that I think is the most relevant to what we're getting into here, and we're going to be talking about this particular concept again and again as a thread, a recurring theme throughout the class, is this idea of making statements. And that is, and if you don't like the word pronouncements, if that's a little bit too highfalutin, then you can say statements. And there are two forms. One is positive statements and normative statements. And let's talk about what these are. So positive statements are this. And first of all, let me describe what positive statements are not, because I know I've had this come up before where people think it's statements of good news. The unemployment rate is 3.5%, which is actually what it is right now. That sounds like good news, but it's not necessarily good news, positive as in, hey, good news. It's instead a statement of what is. It just simply is what it is. And it's considered objective, it's considered measurable. And it really goes back to this intellectual tradition arising out of the Enlightenment, which was sort of the intellectual growth that arose during the Reformation and Industrial Revolution and all that. Something called positivism, which is a way of looking at the world scientifically and without mysticism or or sort of metaphysical or supernatural sorts of explanations for things. So at one point, people may have thought that thunder was caused by the gods bowling. I don't think most people would agree today that as the ancient Greeks did, that the gods were bowling. That's the explanation for thunder, right? So it's looking at an explanation that is measurable and objective. And in and of itself is not controversial, even though the idea may not be good. And so as an example, and I know the unemployment rate is not 7%, it's 3.5%, it's actually half of that, but we could say the unemployment rate is currently 7%. And without engendering whether this is good or bad, we're just simply saying this is what it is. Now, the more important statement is really where economists come in, particularly in terms of influencing policymakers, whether they are government policymakers, corporate policymakers, or whomever, or unions, or whomever. And then there's normative economic statements, and those statements of what should be. And this is, I think, where maybe all the trouble starts to sort of begin. And that's much more subjective. What I think should be is maybe not what you think should be. We're all different. We have different points of view on things. And so as a result, these tend to be more controversial. Excuse me, they don't have to be controversial, but they may be controversial. And that is, I think something on maybe I think that taxes are too high and taxes should be cut. And someone else believes, hey, taxes are too low and we should raise taxes, particularly on higher income people, right? That is a long running argument that's been going on forever. It really has. As long as we've been taxing people, the question is who should be taxed, at what rate? Are taxes too high? Are they too low? Are they too high on this income group? Are they too low on this income group, etc.? And there's no agreement because we're all different. We've all got different sorts of motivations. And so it's much more subjective and it's much more controversial. And the key thing is they form the foundation for advising policy. And economic policies, I think I sort of began to discuss earlier, may be controversial. And so if I make a normative economic statement, the unemployment rate should be 5%, okay? And you may think, well, that's not the correct unemployment rate. Maybe it should be lower. And there are some who argue the unemployment rate is actually too low right now. And that in order to slow the inflation down that we've got, we need to raise the unemployment rate, which, by the way, the unemployment rate for last month, that is for the month of December, actually went down, not up. And this is against the backdrop of our government raising interest rates dramatically last year. The economy just doesn't seem to be slowing down, and the job market is strong. So that aside, though, the issue is that the correct rate? Is unemployment at 5%? Is that the correct rate that we should have? And so nobody would really agree, right? Agree. Maybe that's the right way to put it. By the way, if you frame this from probably one of the policies which are promoted by government, which is maybe the most controversial, maybe in my lifetime, which probably includes all of your lifetimes, and that was the Affordable Care Act. President Obama had eventually gotten done, but was a very painful process if you were able to pick up on that around 2009, 2010. It just went on forever and ever and ever. And so President Obama made a statement that said that 47 million Americans did not have health insurance. Okay, that was an objective, measurable statement. 47 million Americans did not have any health insurance. Now, what was President Obama's normative statement, which, by the way, was very controversial? His normative statement, which would include the word should, was what, right? What did President Obama believe should happen?
No Americans.
What's that?
That no American or all Americans.
All Americans should have health insurance. That's what President Obama believes, all Americans should have health insurance. And so as a result, they created markets where you could get into, they did away with pre-existing conditions where if you left a job, in the old days, if you left a job, you had, I don't know, some diabetes or something, some chronic condition or just some history of a condition, you'd be turned down for health insurance. You'd be without health insurance. Not a good place to be. That was done away with, all those things. But this was extremely controversial. And it was a very ugly and contentious battle that he eventually prevailed. President Obama did get the Affordable Care Act done. And he probably didn't get all that he wanted, I'm sure, but that's the political process. There was some give and take and whatnot. But I remember how controversial it was. You had people, really using ugly, terminology, calling him a Nazi and calling him a communist, which is those are two contradictory things in the first place. But it really, that's pretty much the most contentious thing that I can recall, where basically what he was saying is every American should have health insurance, which in most countries of the world, that would not be controversial, but it was here, certainly, and in the end, he prevailed. And as a result, the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land, and subsequent efforts to get rid of it did not succeed. And so, as a result, more Americans have access to health insurance. That does not mean that there are people who are uninsured. There still are. By Congress, and so that sort of encouraged some people, particularly younger and healthier people, to say, I'm not going to buy health insurance at all. So even if my employer offers it, I'm going to take my chances. And younger and healthier people can do that. But as people get older and have families, that tends not to be a strategy. But that was one of the ones that just as an example of just the contentious nature of economics at times, and that is the idea, and some people don't agree. And there was lots of contention about that. And there is about lots of economic issues, whether it's about taxes, regulation, things like trade with other countries and whatnot, those do tend to come up, okay? So questions about any of that in terms of what economists do, particularly this idea of positive economic statements. And I don't know that this is really, I'm trying to think if that's in chapter 1 or chapter 2. I don't really recall, but again, I'm sort of weaving in and out of both of those. Okay, let's move on. So what I want to do is, and I think I mentioned this at the outset, is I want to talk a bit about economic actors. Because I said that what we were going to do primarily in the first couple of class sessions is talk about the who, what, when, where, why of economics. And so let's talk a bit about the who's who. So we're going to discuss economic actors in the economy. And we're going to make the case. Well, first of all, let's talk about why we use the term actors. And if you think about what actors do, is they play different roles. I think this is important, and I like the term actors. Excuse me. I know that some economists like the term agents, particularly for those who operate on behalf of others. But actors is good because what do actors do? They play different roles. So Harrison Ford can be both Han Solo and Indiana Jones, right? Play both roles. Sorry about that. It was changed my asthma medication. I don't think it's the right the right solution. So actors play different roles. So think about this. What was the scenario that I talked about earlier with street level economics? At 9 to 5, you can be a worker, and that's your role. And after 5 o'clock, you're a consumer. And so you're the same person, but you're playing a different role. And both roles have got an economic aspect to them. And one of the things that I think is important to know about economics is that we're all sort of economic beings for the most part. And we've all got a role to play. And I suppose the only people who would sort of fall out of that definition would be people who sort of live on their own, off the grid, so to speak. There are people, my wife's got a cousin who lives in Alaska. He's pretty off the grid. He's almost one of those TV show kind of guys, he's not quite there, but he's sort of he doesn't trade a lot with others and shoots a lot of his own food and all this foods, vegetables and all this kind of stuff. That is a small percentage of people anymore. Instead, we pretty much are connected with others, and so we play different roles. And so the 3 roles are households, firms, and governments. Now, there's one actor group here that's not included, but it's intentional, and I'll tell you why it was deleted here, or not included, I should say deleted. And that is the not-for-profit sector. And I don't mean at all to diminish the role of not-for-profits because they do play a role in the economy. However, when it comes to the actions which nonprofits engage in, they look a lot like firms, actually. They tend to be very much concerned with cost and controlling costs. They tend to have payrolls. They want to expand revenues and all that. So in that way, they tend to look a lot like actual business firms. Okay. So let's talk about households and how we define them. We're going to say they're comprised of natural persons. I put that in quotes because it's sort of a legal term. And as people as we know people to be. Now you might be asking yourself, what is Okay, people like we know people. Well, what are non-people? And that would be non-biological people. And that is, from a legal standpoint, there are lots of legal artifices like trusts and estates and foundations and corporations itself is a sort of a legal artifice. And a corporation is a legal personhood. We put them under firms here because they're different sorts of behaviors. So we are talking about people as people here, biological entities like you and me. And the household itself can be as small as one person. And today we're seeing households internally composed of all kinds of different arrangements that didn't exist before. And yet economically, we're still saying a household could be as small as one person, as large as whatever, even though households themselves can be quite diverse from one another. Multiple generations living in the same households. Same-sex marriage is now the law of the land. So that would not have been a particular definition of a household 50 years ago, or even less period of time. From an economic standpoint, though, the roles of households really have not changed in terms of consumption and providing labor, and we're going to get to that when we get into this circular flow model. Okay. Second is firms, and here we're going to talk about this is where we are sort of going to kind of diverge, and we're not including the not-for-profit sector just because their role is very similar to this, with the exception of the fact that business firms, we're going to say, are privately owned and for-profit. Those are the two distinguishing characteristics: privately owned, that is non-governmentally owned, and for-profit. And here I want to make one other caveat, and that is just to sort of recognize that these are sometimes, whenever we have these categories we're trying to drop actors into, we always sort of miss the fact that there are exceptions to a lot of these rules. And one of those would be those organizations which look a little bit quasi-governmental, a little bit private. And so how would you, in other words, define Sandia National Labs? It's really difficult. It's not a firm. It's not really a not-for-profit. It's actually managed, I believe, still by the University of California. It's got lots of governmental control. It's got a lot of military involvement. I mean, how do you actually categorize that? It's difficult. So there are outliers. We get that. And we know there are going to be outliers like that. But for the most part, it's useful as a model creation to sort of look at this. And by the way, this is really our first model that we're going to be building of the economy. And we talk about models. What are models? Models are simply representations of reality. They're simulations. They're scaled down versions of something, just in order to simplify the analysis to make understanding very easy. So if you think about a blueprint for a house, right? So it's really a model of a floor plan. But what you don't need are things like light switches necessarily, or carpeting, or wall decor, or even things like light fixtures. You get the idea. Here's a room, there's a door, there's a window, maybe you have a window, maybe you don't. But it just kind of gives you the idea of the dimensions, the relation to other rooms, etc. That's what a model is. So here, maybe we kick out Sandia National Labs. They don't really fit, so we don't include them, but they've got a role to play nonetheless. And then the final one is governments. And in this country, we've got a federal and state division. And here, what's interesting about this is the whole notion of what federalism is. I think if you go back to the very early very earliest days of the American Republic, federalism really meant very dominant state governments, and really the term state everywhere in the world refers to a sovereign entity, a country, essentially, and a fairly weak federal confederation that was mostly together for military purposes and maybe international relations, and that was about it. And the president, in some of the early documents of the founders, they talked about the president as being analogous to a clerk. I don't know if you can believe that. We think of the president now as flying in on Air Force One, being this sort of imperial character, but they viewed him as being something of a clerk, just to sign off on documents. But they then went ahead and made him commander-in-chief at the time they said Army and Navy. That's what's in the Constitution. Obviously today that's bigger, and you have a Space Force and all that. But the idea was that the federal government would be sort of weak and the states would be sort of dominant. And today I think we would probably, it's the opposite condition, where we have a very dominant federal government and relatively weak state governments. And I say this particularly from a regulatory standpoint, from a microeconomic standpoint, which is what we're mostly interested in here, not so much taxation, but from a regulatory standpoint, I think the federal government is very dominant in terms of state, or in terms of regulation of business, regulation of commercial activity. it isn't the states don't have regulation, but it tends to be sort of subsidiary to federal regulation. And we're going to get into this when we talk about regulation and what it's about. The idea of we're going to sort of present the idea of regulation as being sort of the referees on the field, blowing the whistle, right? We're now at the height of football playoff season getting ready to start. Right? So if you watch football, you know, a lot of times you'll see a play being called back for a penalty. Well, that's sort of analogous to where our government sort of fits in, sort of blowing the whistle and trying to prevent abuses from happening so that a level playing field is created to the best to the best degree possible. Okay, and then if we label these together as sectors, then we would dump the households and firms together as what we call the private sector. These are terms, public sector, private sector, are probably terms that are familiar to a lot of you. But I want to talk about the term sector itself, just so that we know what that is and why it's important for us to know about. So a sector is not an industry, it's not a group of individuals necessarily, it's sort of a division of attributes. Excuse me, a division of something based upon attributes, I should say. So if we go back to football here, we've got two sectors in the National Football League. And what are those two sectors? The AFC and the NFC. Now, is it logical that the Pittsburgh Steelers are in the AFC? Across the state, the Philadelphia Eagles are in the NFC? No, it's mostly arbitrary. Okay, it's mostly arbitrary, I think. But what about these divisions when they're not arbitrary, when they mean something? And that is when we group together by different interests and different motivations, which is what we're trying to do with sectors of the economy. By the way, when economists look at industry, oftentimes we'll look at sectors of the economy, not just individual industries. So healthcare is a sector of the economy. And I know that during the healthcare debate, and in a lot of news stories you'll hear about healthcare, they'll talk about the healthcare industry. Well, there is no healthcare industry because it's composed of, there's a healthcare sector composed of lots of industries. There's the drug industry, there are clinics, there are doctors, there are the hospital industry, there's the rehab industry, there's the medical products industry, and it goes on and on, health insurance industry. It goes on and on and on, but they all kind of group together under this sector. Or something like telecommunications. What is that? It's broadcasting, it's internet, it's the telephone system, long distance and local, it's cell phone service. It's all that sort of grouped together as being the telecom sector of the economy. And so there are about 11 industrial sectors that we include in that. And so as a result, when we're talking about sectors, we're talking about collections of actors that it makes sense to group together. And so in this case, the private sector, decisions are made privately and in these actors' self-interest. So households will do things in their own self-interest. We are seeing, I just saw an article yesterday about the so-called quit rate, and that is workers leaving jobs. And it's about as high as it's been lately. I think it peaked around 2021 as people were coming out of the pandemic. Some people were leaving jobs. They felt like they couldn't leave before because a lot of companies really weren't doing a lot of hiring. And we were in sort of a mini recession in 2020 when the pandemic first began. But the quit rate is people's decisions to leave a job. And you're free to leave a job. If you don't want to work someplace, you can just say, I'm going to leave, I'm going to quit. You're not necessarily bound to it. Likewise, businesses have the unfortunate ability to say, you know what, you're done, you can get out. And frankly, they have the right to do that in most places. And sometimes maybe offering good excuses, sometimes not. Sometimes you're not needed, that sort of thing. So maybe that's something that's not always great about the free market economy, but it does happen. So decisions are made privately. If you're a household, you can quit your job, go to a new job, start a business. Whatever you want to do. If you want to buy a motorcycle, you don't have to run it by anybody, just go do it. If you're able to do it, buy a motorcycle, right? Business firms, if you're making shampoo and conditioner and you decide conditioner is not as profitable as shampoo, maybe stop making conditioner and focusing on shampoo, for instance. So you do it for your own self-interest. And this differs then from the public sector where decisions tend to be made publicly. And I say tend to be made publicly. And in the public interest or the societal interest. Sometimes people snicker at this idea of decisions made publicly because sometimes we don't really know what government is always up to. And sometimes things happen where we are sort of surprised the government has made a decision, but the objective, at least theoretically, is that decisions tend to be made publicly but they're mainly the general public interest for the most part. At least that's the objective for the most part. Okay. So those are the sectors of the economy. And are there any questions about any of these at this point? Okay, well, what I want to do, and I'm going to sort of real quickly before, we've only got about 5 minutes left. And what I want to do is this. We talked about this idea of model building and why it's important for us to be able to construct useful models of the economy so that we can understand, more importantly, how the economy tends to work. And for those watching on the video, on the video link, I want to go the other direction here with this. And I want to build the very first model that we're going to be dealing with in the class. And it is also covered in your textbook. It's called the circular flow model. And let's talk about the circular flow model and what it's about and what it is. It basically is simply sketching out the relationship between these actors. Okay. And I'll probably be building on this a bit more throughout the semester. The circular flow model, where it takes these actor groups and puts them together. And so we're just simply going to say, okay, we're going to put firms here. For no particular reason, we're going to put government here. And we're going to have households out here. And by the way, if you were to pull up a search engine and Google the term circular flow model, you will literally have millions and millions and millions of hits. And a lot of these will look different than one another, where you might have government up here, you might have households out here. And some of these get very, very detailed with things like international trade flows and things like borrowing rights from the International Monetary Fund. I just want you to know that if you do this on your own, you're likely to find some very complicated relationships. But right now, what I'm going to focus on are two very basic relationships. And that is this. What is one of the most basic relationships that we can see within the economy? And that is the transfer of goods from business firms to households. It's a pretty basic transaction. It's something that we see all the time, the transfer of goods from firms to households. But likewise, don't households also provide something to firms themselves? And they do, and so we simply refer to that as the transfer of labor. This is really what the Industrial Revolution is characterized by, and that is people leaving home to go provide labor to firms. And I realize that since the pandemic began, there's been all this discussion about working from home and whatnot, and some people like it and some employers like it. Some employers really don't like it at all. In fact, there's been sort of a pushback on that whole thing of the return to work policy. And I know the CEO of Chase Bank had said that we're a work from work company. And so her opinion does not want people working from home so very much. So you get the idea, but for the most part, this idea of providing labor to someone outside of oneself. So goods and labor being exchanged in this sort of clockwise motion. Then I set clockwise for no apparent reason, it's mostly arbitrary. But we know that goods are not transferred to households for free, but there's got to be compensation for that. So as a result, there's got to be spending or consumption, and that is a dollar flow in that direction. And then we know that labor is not provided for free. And I'm about out of green ink here, and I apologize if that doesn't show up too well in the video. We know that households provide labor for wages, and so one thing compensates for the other. And in fact, this is one way that we, in economics and finance, and even in the accounting world, for those of you who've taken things, say that what is the value of something, and it's the amount that someone's willing to pay and what someone's willing to accept for that thing. So when we see a baseball player signing a contract for $400 million, that must be what someone feels that person's labor is worth, whether we agree with it or not. And there may be a little bit of a misallocation of resources to pay a baseball player $400 million over 10 years, but nonetheless, that someone has a different thought in mind. And likewise, what is the value of a good? Well, the value of the good is what someone's willing to accept and what someone's willing to pay for. So the thing about this is this: you've got one flow, a set of flows going this way, and a set of flows going that way in compensation for that. And essentially, when we talk about this red arrow here, we're talking about something that we call the physical flow. And that term itself is probably even a bit outdated now, because of the fact that a lot of labor is not particularly physical, and a lot of the goods are not particularly physical. And in fact, there has been sort of an effort that really I started to see more after when the financial economy went through some difficulties where we were sort of referring to that as the quote unquote real economy. That is the real economy where we live. Now, is there an unreal economy? Well, not so much, but it's a bit different. That's the financial flow that goes in the other direction. And this is the so-called money economy, which is not unreal, but it's a little bit more difficult to follow the money. Believe it or not. And I'm sorry that green, I'm gonna have to run upstairs and get some more green ink. The money economy, which is this is financial flow and money economy. It's used to compensate for the flow of goods and services. Okay, so this is the very basic model of how the economy looks and how it works. There are bits and pieces that we can add on to this, and we will as we get going throughout the course. And so anyway, so it looks like we got pretty much done what we needed to get done for this week. And so we are right on target with what I hope to achieve. So there are questions for me. We've got about 30 seconds to go before the class is over. Well, feel free to get with me. I'm available. I'm here all the time for the most part. And when I'm not, you can just send me an email. I'll try to get with you as quickly as possible. I've had lots of emails the last couple of days, like a record, just because of all the things that are happening at the beginning of the semester. So I usually get back a little bit quicker, but I will get through these and I will respond and I will get back in touch with you. Yes.
Are these slides online?
Yes, they're in the Brightspace.
Right.
Yes. And you can download them and print them whatever you prefer. All right, have a great weekend. See you on, we're not here Monday. Monday's a holiday. So we're not here Monday. It's the Martin Luther King holiday. So I'll see you a week from today. Okay? Have a great weekend.